Today we have two presentations, and let me begin. The first would be done by Kanishka Werawella. He is an MSc in economics from the University of Warwick, where he was a Commonwealth Scholar. He is now a lecturer in economics at the Department of Economics, University of Colombo. His research interests lie at the intersection of labor, gender, and development economics. He will make a presentation of around 20 to 25 minutes, a maximum of 30 minutes, and that'll be followed by comments by the two esteemed discussants who've been generous to give their time. First, we listen to Dr. Tiloka De Silva. She earned her PhD in economics from LSE and is at the faculty of the Business University of Moratuwa. He's also a consultant to the World Bank and researches on macro development, labor, and education economics. She'll be followed by the senior professor Amala De Silva, who's with the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. Her teaching areas include public finance and macroeconomics. Her research work has been primarily on health, poverty, and inequality in Sri Lanka. So over to Kanishka.
All right. Thank you very much, Srini, for the generous introduction. And also, I'd like to thank NTT for the opportunity and also the support provided throughout the process of producing this working paper. And also to my two reviewers, Dr. Tiloka De Silva and also Senior Prof Amala De Silva for their generous comments and advices in order to improve. My topic the title of my presentation is Do Higher Taxes Reduce Wealth? This is a difference in differences analysis based on Sri Lanka's 2022 tax reform. So we all are aware that the tax is a huge deal in Sri Lanka during the past couple of years. The tax policies were got amended during, couple of times. So I'm trying to understand not a very common approach to tax policies in Sri Lanka, because normally what happens is we take very fiscal based approach when we design and when we implement tax policies. So here I'm trying to use some sort of a labor market approach to understand this situation. Let me begin my presentation. Let's move to introduction. Why study tax reforms and labor supply in Sri Lanka? So let me begin with a simple thought experiment. Imagine you are an employee during earning just around 100,000 rupees a month. And suddenly, with a single policy change, part of your income now falls under taxation. Overnight, you take home pay drops. Now you might start asking several questions from you. Should I work those extra hours? Should my spouse also look for a job now? Or should I cut back since the effort no longer feels worthwhile? There can be several questions like that. So this is like a central puzzle in labor economics, how people make decisions when it comes to the trade-off between labor and leisure. And right now, I'm trying to incorporate taxation into this and try to understand how people make decisions, or what are the changes that implementation of tax policy will be on the labor supply. So that is what I'm trying to do, how taxation shapes people's decision about whether to work and how much to work. But why this question matters for Sri Lanka? So that's the most important thing. In Sri Lanka, this issue is not just academic or not only a research, it's a very practical issue. Governments have decided, have been struggling with persistent fiscal challenges, as we all are aware. And successive administrations have frequently adjusted income tax policies, often not as part of a long-term strategy maybe, but as a quick fixes to plug budget holes. not the most recent amendment with the current government, but the previous one with the Ranil Wickremesinghe government. Under the Inland Revenue Act, Inland Revenue Amendment Act number 45 of 2022, sharply lowered the tax-free threshold to 100,000 Sri Lankan rupees from 250,000 Sri Lankan rupees per month. This reform directly affected mainly the middle income earners, let's say, and also the formal sector middle income earners or middle income workers. But almost no attention was paid how these tax changes ripple through the labor markets, whether they discourage work, drive people into informality, or affect men and women differently. So these are certain microeconomic and labor economic questions that we need to understand and that we should try to address, actually, given the uh, tax changes. This is where my study comes in. I treat 2023 tax threshold revision as a quasi-natural experiment. So I'm trying to use, I use a difference in difference approach, comparing labor market behavior of workers who are just above and who are just below the new tax-free threshold, which is 100,000 Sri Lankan rupees. I focus on the formal sector because this is where compliance is highest and apply a precise bandwidth around the 100,000 rupees cutoff. To test the robustness, I extend this into a difference in difference framework by introducing another comparison group from the informal sector. So particularly, this allows me to filter out the broader economic shocks that Sri Lanka was experiencing at the time, to great extent at least. And because I also care about heterogeneity, I examine the role of age, education, gender, and see whether responsiveness differ across these groups too. So based on this, my research question particularly, I can word like, did the sharp reduction in Sri Lanka's personal tax threshold in 2023 reduce work effort and or alter labor force participation? And how did these effects differ across gender and formal, informal divides? So given that, I would like to give you some overview of the recent tax reforms in Sri Lanka. And I didn't include very recent tax amendment which took place under the current government, because when I started this study, that haven't been there. So I thought of stick with these three major reforms. So the 2017 Inland Revenue Act, or the 2017 reform, was a landmark change, I would say, aimed at simplifying the tax system, broadening the tax base, strengthening compliance. The annual tax-free threshold for employment income was raised from 750 to 1.2 million rupee. This is annually. And the top marginal rate increased from 16% to 24%. So taxes were collected through the pay system, or pay as you earn system, ensuring timely and predictable revenue flows. But that was under the Maithripala Sirisena government, and in 2020, under the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government, the government introduced the advanced personal income tax, or APIT, simply, as an optional scheme for higher income employee earning over 3 million rupee per year. It applied progressive rate from 6% to 18% with no resident employee mandatorily enrolled. So this was intended to modernize tax collection and offer flexibility for higher earners. So frequently it's said that this was one reason behind our collapse in 2022. So keeping that aside, after 2020, in 2022, the Inland Revenue Amendment Act number 45 marked a significant pivot because the personal income tax-free threshold was reduced again from 3 million to 1.2 million rupees per year, which is a dramatically expanding the number of taxpayers. So tax slabs were widened and rates increased up to 36%. Crucially, APID deduction became mandatory for all employees, not optional. The objective was very clear: broaden the tax base, increase revenue, and improve compliance. Though this reform represents a more progressive approach than 2020 adjustment, and it forms the core of my study actually. And then when it comes to physical challenges, to understand why 2022 reform was necessary, we need to look at the broader fiscal context. So as an example, Sri Lanka faced a chronic budget deficit and rising public debt issue, a situation exacerbated by uh, COVID-19 pandemic and several issues in terms of our policies. Likewise, by early 2020, official reserves were nearly zero. Uh, Repeated sovereign credit downgrades severely constrained the government's ability to borrow. So in April 2020, the government even had to temporarily suspend select foreign debt payments. Debt payments. So in response, Sri Lanka engaged the IMF requesting an extended fund facility in March 2020. So after that, with IMF support, a series of fiscal consolidation measures were introduced, including revenue enhancing reforms to address structural weaknesses in tax collection. In 2020, tax reforms can be seen as a direct response to these pictures or these pressures. Expanding the tax base to capture more taxpayers, systematically increase revenue through mandatory APID deductions, and improving progressivity compared to 2020 reforms. But beyond these fiscal objectives, the reform raised important question: how do these changes influence labor market decisions? Something not that we consider when we make such policies. So how do household adjust, particularly across formal and informal sectors? How do gender dynamics shape responses? So these are the empirical questions that my study seek to answer using 2022 reform as a quasi-natural experiment to examine behavioral and welfare responses to fiscal policy shocks. So in this graph, you can clearly see the three adjustments that I discussed earlier. And this is the tax reform that I'm focusing, or that I based with my study. And this shows you the income, the annual taxable income during the three policy amendments. Okay, let's move to data and methods. So first, for this study, I basically rely on the labor force survey, which is conducted quarterly by the Department of Census and Statistics of Sri Lanka. So this is the most reliable data set we have in Sri Lanka to study employment, wages, and also labor market behaviors, and etc. I use data from 2020 to 2023 for my main analysis. And since it captures the before and after the 2022 tax reform, I also use data from 2017 and 2018 as placebo years to check whether my results are driven by policy or just general labor market trends. So my outcome of interest is labor supply measures in mainly two ways, broadly in two ways: extensive margin of labor supply and intensive margin of labor supply. When it comes to extensive margin of labor supply, so it means whether people are employed or not, basically. And when it comes to intensive margin of labor supply, it means how many hours that these individuals actually work. So because the tax applies only to formal sector employees with salaries, my analysis mainly, particularly my intensive margin based analysis, mainly focuses on monthly wage earners in the formal sector. And the informal sector is still important, but more as a comparison group in this context. So here I'm trying to idealize my identification strategy attached to the intensive margin labor supply scenario. The key to my identification strategy lies in timing and also the thresholds. The reform took effect on the 1st of January 2023. So this gives us a clear dividing line. Everything before January 2023 is pre-tax period, and everything after is the post-tax period. Sorry. For practical reasons, my analysis focuses on the year 2023 as the post-reform period because the data wasn't available for 2024. Now, the critical feature of 2022 amendment is that it lowered the tax-free threshold to the 100,000 rupees per month from 250,000 rupees per month. So that means starting in 2023, anyone earning more than that suddenly becomes liable for income tax. So here is how I built my comparison. My treatment group is formal sector workers earning just above the threshold between 100,000 to 130,000 rupees a month. These are the people who were newly pulled into the tax net. And when it comes to my control group is workers earning between 17,000 and 100,000 rupees. So they are also formal and salaried, but crucially, they were below the tax threshold even before the reform. In other words, they were unaffected by this change. By comparing these two groups before and after the reform, I can tease out the causal effect of taxation itself, separate from the broader economic crisis, which of course affected everyone in the economy in the country. This setup provides me with a quasi-natural experiment, one group newly taxed and one group untaxed, and both experiencing the same macroeconomic shocks. So differences in how they adjust can attribute to the tax reform, and that's my whole argument. So as you can see in the graph, so before 2023, January 1st, it's pre-period, and after 2023, January 1st, it's post-period, and there is treatment group and there is control group. So if you take the treatment group, it includes formal sector workers who earn between 100,000 to 130. With the control group, it means 70,000 to 100,000. So if you take the control group, in both pre and post period, those people are not affected by the tax reform. But when it comes to the treatment group, they are not affected in the pre-period or the pre-tax period, but they are affected in the post-tax period. So this is how I'm trying to build my causal link. And methodologically, I use a difference in difference approach, as I explained, similar to the very famous Card and Kruger study on minimum wage. The basic idea, as I told you, if both groups were following the same trend or a similar trend before 2023, any sudden divergence after 2023 can be attributed to tax reform. But of course, Sri Lanka was in the middle of a major economic crisis with inflation, currency depreciation, hyperinflation, job losses everywhere. To make sure I'm not picking up this effect of crisis, I strengthen the design with the differences analysis, or a DDD model or a framework. Here I use informal workers as an additional baseline. They felt the crisis but not the tax. So that helps me separate pure tax effect from general crisis effect. So one limitation is the hours worked are only observed for those already employed to study extensive margin. That is whether people enter or exit the employment. I built what's called pseudo panel. This means I group people into subset based on age and education, and then track these groups across time quarter by quarter from 2020 to 2023. So that gives me a panel of about 960 group level observations, which I can analyze if it were panel study. So, but with this, there is no any continuous, so there is no any binary treatment like 1 or 0. Discrete treatment. So I have to develop a continuous treatment. So in order to do that, I develop a byte called share of affected workers in each group. Basically, what fraction of people in group earn above 100,000 but below 250,000. But this continuous treatment variable let me study how the intensity of the tax bite varies across different types of workers. And these are some mathematical equations that I used when I developed the byte or the share of affected workers. So workers wage between 100,000 to 250,000 were used. and calculating that, and I name those people as affected workers, and also the total population in particular subsets or age education subsets are the total people or total workers in that particular subset. So taking the ratio in between these two, I develop the share of affected workers. And this is the empirical specification of difference in difference. And I'm particularly interested in beta 3, which will capture the average treatment effect on treated. And this is the DDD framework. And in DDD framework also, beta 7 is what I'm interested in, which will capture the causal effect, pure tax effect on formal workers relative to informal. And when it comes to extensive margin, as you can see, again, gamma is the coefficient that I'm interested in this particular scenario. And also I'm interested in transformation effect because as a result of tax imposition, there can be transfers from formal sector to informal sector and informal sector to formal sector. In order to capture that, I employed these two regression analysis. So here beta 1 and delta 1, simple delta 1 is the baseline link, and beta 2 and simple beta 2, beta 2 and simple delta 2 is the policy driven transformation effect. If it is negative, shift out formality into informality likewise. And also I carried out certain robustness checks in order to correct the sample selection bias and also to check the parallel trend assumption and group comparability, and also to capture the whether there is a spillover effect. Let's move to results and discussion. And let's start with the descriptive analysis. Here we are looking at overall employment trend in the formal and informal sector. The red vertical line marks the January 2023, the moment when the new income tax threshold of 100,000 Sri Lankan rupees took effect. What we see here is the formal employment shows a clear dip after the policy, while informal employment rises almost 1-for-1. So this suggests that some workers did not exit the labor force completely. Instead, they switch from formal to informal. This reallocation makes sense. Informal jobs are not taxed, and for workers close to threshold, informality becomes more attractive. And now we are looking at wages. So each curve shows the distribution of monthly wages, with red line marking the new 100,000 tax threshold. In the formal sector, or which is shown through the blue color, there are two main things. The curve flattens around the threshold. This is consistent with bunching behavior, where workers and firms adjust wages to avoid crossing into higher taxation. And also the overall rightward shift is modest, meaning that real wage actually fell once we account for inflation and taxes. But when it comes to informal sector or the red curves, we see a strong rightward shift. So this suggests that some higher skilled or higher paid workers moved, maybe, we don't know, maybe into informality while keeping relatively good earnings. So that raises possibility of tax avoidance strategies, or simply the appeal of more flexible and untaxed work. And here I'm taking some sort of a gender perspective here. So male wage distribution consistently lie in the right of the female, confirming the persistent gender wage gaps. Both male and women see some upward shift in 2023, but it's more pronounced for men, especially in the informal sector where wages are more flexible. And also this suggests that men may have been better positioned to take advantage of informal opportunities, while women forced more rigid constraints. So this graph shows the broader persistent structural gaps. And turning now to hours of work. Earlier it was wages, now hours of work. So this figure shows that distribution of weekly hours before and after the tax reform. So what we see is slightly leftward shift in 2023, especially in the middle quarters, which means formal workers on average reduce their hours. This is consistent with the tax disincentive story. We take home pay when take home pay falls, some workers respond by cutting back hours rather than increasing them. So importantly, the peak of the distribution remain in similar places, suggesting that basic structure of the formal work did not change. What changed was the how can I say, average intensity of labor supply. And finally, let's break this down again by gender. For men, men in the formal sector, the 2023 curves shift slightly to right. That means men may have increased hours to compensate for tax bites, essentially trying to maintain pre-tax income. For women, on the other hand, the curves hardly move, so this suggests women had less flexibility to adjust hours, like due to maybe caregiving responsibilities or maybe rigid employment contracts. So anyhow, this asymmetric responses reinforces the central theme that tax shocks interact with gender norms and women's labor supply remains less elastic in Sri Lankan context. So with this, I'm moving to my empirical results. So here I'm showing you, we see the baseline results in the intensive margin of labor supply.
Kanishka, you have 5 minutes for this. Please go ahead.
Okay. I estimate, I'm sorry, Srini. I estimate both difference in differences and also difference in differences models. I'm showing the results here. So the DID results show that formal wage earners near the tax threshold significantly reduced their working hours after the reform. On average, treated workers worked about fewer hours, which is roughly 3.6% decline attached to the log wages. When I move to DDD results, where informal workers are used as an additional counterfactual group, the estimated effects are much larger. Here, hours of work dropped by almost 28 hours and around 52%. So these results are also statistically significant, suggesting that simpler DID model maybe understates the true impact. So overall, the findings point to a clear reduction in hours of work in the formal sector following the tax reform. And here I'm showing you the gender-specific results. And this is kind of a robustness check for my baseline results also. And if we are particularly interested in gender aspect or gender differences, we see that women already work significantly fewer hours than men, roughly 5 to 7 hours less per week, which translates to about 11 to 15% lower labor supply. So there is clear pre-existing disparity. But when we introduce the interaction term, the tax reform, interaction term of the tax reform and being female, the picture changes. The interaction term is positive and statistically significant, meaning that the negative impact of tax increase was less severe for women compared to men. So in other words, male workers cut back their hours more sharply in response to reform. Finally, even after controlling for factors like age, education, marital status, industry sector, the results hold. So this suggests that the observed gender differences are not just due to differences in demographics or job characteristics, but reflect a genuine difference in behavioral response to the tax policy. And this is the extensive labor market, labor supply. I'm sorry. So here the main findings is here we are looking at the employment level. We see a modest but statistically significant positive relationship. Groups with higher share of affected workers tend to have significantly higher overall formal and informal employment levels. However, when we shift to employment dynamics, changes and growth rates, the picture reverses. Here, higher share of affected workers is associated with slower employment growth. For overall employment, the change is about minus 1.7 units, and the growth rate falls by almost 1 percentage point. In formal employment, the effect is even stronger. So with both level change and the growth rate significantly negative. For the informal sector, the relationship is much weaker. While there is a positive static correlation, the changes and growth rates are not significant. So this is the transformation effect. I'll skip this slide for the moment. And here, some robustness check results are given. Here in the first table, I corrected the selection bias using the Heckman's two-step method. And in the second step, the placebo DID and DDD regression using 2017 and 2018 data is given here. And these are again some robustness checks. So earlier with our original analysis, the bandwidth was 30%. I took 70,000 to 130,000. Here, I took a much narrower income band and much broader income band. So as you can see, there is no difference in terms of the coefficient and the magnitudes of the coefficients. With this, I'm moving to the conclusion. So this study examines labor market effect of January 2023 income tax reform in Sri Lanka. At intensive margin, we find a clear reduction in Sri Lanka in hours worked among those directly affected, consistent with the standard labor leisure trade-off. The substitution effect dominates, so individual work less as after-tax wages falls. At the extensive margin, however, there is an increase in overall employment participation. So this could be primarily because secondary earners enter the labor market maybe, or household income losers. When household income losers, we also observe a sectoral shift, the labor moving between formal and informal employment. The informal sector absorbs part of the adjustment, acting as a buffer in response to the reduced attractiveness of the formal. And also, we understood some gender-specific results also. And the policy implications. So mainly these findings highlight the importance of complementary policy measures, tools like earned income tax credits, subsidized childcare, and targeted cash transfer can help preserve work incentives and protect vulnerable groups. It is particularly important to adapt a gender-sensitive approach, since women often face structural barriers such as unpaid care responsibilities, mobility constraint, occupational segregations, likewise. A few caveats are worth noting. First, this analysis focuses on formal sector employees earning between 70,000 to 130,000 rupees, particularly attached to intensive margin of labor supply, so the results may not generalize beyond this group. Second, the period coincide 2022-2023, where we had the economic crisis, something that we should carefully consider. And looking ahead, future research maybe should leverage longitudinal household level data, which is lacking in Sri Lanka, which is a really huge barrier in terms of our data. Structural modeling, to have a better understanding in terms of how fiscal shocks affect welfare and productivity, and guide the design of equitable and growth compatible tax policies in developing economies like Sri Lanka. With that, I'm concluding. Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry, Srini. I took a little bit.
No, thank you, Kanishka. That's quite fascinating. And in fact, the world's fascinated by such labor market studies across very different contexts. I would just end up requesting you to put in your future agenda a revisit of the DID a couple of years later, because as we know, as expectations shift, and this is the new normal, the new tax rates are the new normal, labor market responses may change a bit. It might be worth revisiting a couple of years later, almost an identical this thing, just to see whether once there is a new norm, there's a shift in norm, do labor market responses change? But let me now turn to Dr. Tiloka De Silva. I mean, we've stood to gain a lot from her comments, so we have an opportunity here. You have 10 minutes, Tiloka. I hope that's good for you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Srini, and thank you, Kanishka, for your presentation. Thank you for inviting me to be a discussant for this paper. I have to say, I really enjoyed reading it. And I mean, I didn't have a lot in terms of comments for improvement. I thought that the paper was really well thought out and executed. Like Srini said, it's really nice to see kind of macroeconomic analyses that focus these types of macro topics, especially for countries like Sri Lanka, where this kind of analysis is relatively scarce. So Kanishka basically makes use of this quasi-experimental setting, where the income tax exemption threshold was brought down from 250,000 to 100,000. in January 2023. And this allows us or gives him a nice kind of setting in which to isolate the effect of the tax reform from other things which were also going on at the same time. So I was just thinking while I was reading the paper, the crisis has been bad and it has had a lot of negative implications, but at least we have an opportunity for some good economic research. So let me just kind of quickly summarize what the paper meant to me and like the key thoughts that came to my mind while I was reading through it, and then maybe a few suggestions in terms of things you could probably look at in a little bit more detail. So the study basically looks at this kind of textbook problem, right, of what happens to labor supply when you have a change in income tax. And Kanishka basically looks at it at different levels, looking at how workers change, how much they work, whether they decide whether to work or not, as well as whether they decide where to work. So whether they should work in the formal sector or informal sector, following these kinds of changes. And this analysis, to me, the most important part of it was that the tax reforms were motivated by macroeconomic considerations primarily. And it's really important to also get a handle of what is going on at the micro level or the household level in order to really evaluate the impact of these reforms. So Sri Lanka has always had a bad record with tax collection, right? So looking at the data from like the 1990s, tax revenue just continues to decline as a percentage of GDP. And it's for many reasons, some of which were listed out by Kanishka as well. Governance weaknesses, tax evasion, inconsistent policies, and so on. So as a result, Sri Lanka has had a long history of fiscal deficits, unsustainable borrowing, and we spiraled into this crisis in 2022. So since the crisis was predominantly, or a large part of it was because of a lack of revenue mobilization, the taxes were kind of a no-brainer in terms of where to start. So the income tax reforms were not just the threshold changes, but also much higher tax rates across the board. And from 2023 onwards, we see improvements in the macroeconomic indicators. Tax revenues are going up, primary balances are positive, inflation is eased, and so on. And from the macro side of things, it seems like the country is getting back on track. But like we said, the household impact of these shocks and reforms is relatively less scrutinized. And one of the main reasons for that is that we don't have enough national household data that can be used for evaluating the welfare at a micro level. So at the moment, it's only really the labor force surveys which give us this kind of micro picture. And the micro picture in terms of the labor markets are that the labor markets haven't really recovered yet. So for instance, labor force participation rates are still declining, or they have been declining for the last maybe 4 or 5 years. The labor force has been shrinking, real wages have been eroded, and so on. So I think that this kind of analysis where you look at the micro impacts of macroeconomic policies is really crucial at this juncture. Now, what I found really fascinating about Kanishka's paper was the approach he takes to tease out the effects of the reform from all the other bad stuff which was happening at the same time. It's a difficult thing to do, and I don't know whether the approach does it 100%, but I think it takes it reasonably close to the objective. So by doing this difference in difference and difference in difference in difference strategy, he tries to kind of peel away the effects of the common effect of the crisis from the rest of the reform. And we're comparing people who are before and after the crisis, above and below the income tax threshold, as well as people who are in the formal and informal sector. So by doing this kind of comparison, you're able to kind of get a better handle on what exactly was the reform, as opposed to what was contaminated by the economic crisis in general. So the 4 findings in terms of the quantitative results, hours worked are significantly lower. consistent with the substitution effect. Employment participation has increased slightly, which was, I thought, quite interesting. We see the increased informal sector employment, which is a bit worrisome. And then I also found the kind of gendered implications, which are elaborated a bit more in the revised version of the paper, very interesting as well, which suggests that female workers respond less to these labor market reforms, potentially because they are more constrained in terms of other responsibilities or the types of jobs that they are working in. And the results are robust too, like a battery of sensitivity tests and model specifications. So the policy takeaways, I think, are clear, as Kanishka outlined, and they kind of highlight perhaps the limited scope of continuing to squeeze the middle income earners, that it can have potentially negative labor market implications, especially if people are kind of reducing the hours they work or shifting into informal sector employment, which is not something desirable, which means that more efforts would be needed to kind of expand the base to reduce evasion. The gendered implications are also pretty interesting, and they're also pertinent to other reforms which could be having an impact on women, like the recruitment freeze to the public sector, which has a much higher share of female workers than male workers. And then, of course, one thought which kept going through my mind while reading this paper was also the need we have for fresh data at a household level if we really want to see what has been going on at the grassroots level over the last, 3-4 years. A few suggestions, and then I'll wrap up. So I think some of these you also talked about when you were concluding, but I was thinking some of the implications of your findings could be kind of gone into with a little bit more depth. So for example, what does it really mean if hours worked are being reduced? So if a sample of workers are formal sector employees who are earning monthly salaries and they're not earning kind of hourly rates or daily rates, is this then reflecting a reduction in productivity, or is it something which does not have really an impact on household welfare if incomes are not affected? Perhaps something which you could go into a little bit more in detail. I'm not sure if the LFS has all the data you need for this, as well as the implication of higher employment among your secondary earners, which was the second finding in your analysis. You could probably verify this using the LFS. What kind of people are coming into the labor market as a result of these reforms? Are they going into informal work? What, some kind of information on what's really going on would probably give us a kind of clearer idea on the implications of the results that you have. And then, of course, in future work, I think what would also be really interesting is to kind of broaden the scope. So you focus at the moment on the exemption threshold, but we also obviously have lots of other effects in terms of higher rates. And we also have lots of other types of workers. So for example, you have own account workers who are like 1/3 of the labor force. So if you could maybe, not obviously not in this project, but even in future work, looking at a kind of broader spectrum of what the reform may have done. And I think, as Srini mentioned as well, kind of revisiting the problem a few years down the line, once this has become the new normal, would be really useful. So I just want to say, this is excellent work. I was really happy to read the paper and see the analysis that you've done. You give a very good framework for how we can balance macroeconomic analysis with macroeconomic policy. And I wish you all the best in your future work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tiloka. May I now invite Professor Amala De Silva for comments?
Chairperson, Professor Srinivasan Iyer, Kanishka, who has written this very fascinating paper, which I think everyone, Tiloka and I both were very happy to read because it was so comprehensive. And Tiloka, for all the insightful comments you have made. And the audience who are probably wondering why there is a need for anyone else to discuss this paper, because it was a very thorough coverage of the issues involved. And I'm also wondering that, but Since I undertook to do this presentation, and it was because I evaluated the paper and I was very fascinated by the findings and also by the way it was presented. So I would just thought about what I should talk about, and I came to the conclusion that my contribution would be best if I highlighted three reasons, at least for me personally, which made the paper very important in terms of both the literature, added to the literature, and in terms of policy. And then to go on, like Tiloka did, to suggest some further work that can be done, either by extending this paper, but more likely by resulting in a few follow-up papers. So the first reason I found this paper interesting was the fact that, of course, that was what they were, the whole research initiative was about, combining labor markets with taxation. And here the issue was very much brought home because we are all very much concerned by the impacts it is having on the labor market around us, in particular, where we are hearing people saying, well, if we are getting taxed so much, I feel like, leaving, I feel like retiring. And most worryingly, people saying, well, I want to migrate. And then further impact that has affected particularly university settings is the fact that multi-job holders like myself, Kanishka and Tiloka, among others, are actually challenged by the fact that all the work we do, what Kanishka calls the intensive margin, the extra hours that we were working on different activities, and which are probably considered important by the different institutions where we do that work, are now being cut back by people who are challenged by the fact that whatever work they do and whatever they earn, it is being taxed at very high tax rates. So here, the fact that you are combining labor markets and the public finance and providing an empirical backing for what we have always learned in our public finance courses about the Laffer curve, where high tax rates lead to lower tax revenue, or a upturned U-shaped relationship between tax rates and tax revenue, is here given a very interesting empirical basis, which validates that conclusion that Laffer reached using a very different process in a very different context. So that is what I consider the first important issue. The second issue, of course, because I'm interested in gender, is coming from the fact that you focus so much on the gender differences in the impacts of taxation on males and females. In neoclassical economics, we are often focusing on the fact that people provide labor in relation to the wages that they are going to take. Of course, these wages are subject to taxation. So the take-home wages are what determine, by and large, the amount of labor supplied. But in the case of females, there is a little additional issue here where when females come into the labor force, it often means that they have to spend on caregivers to take their role in the household. So the wages that they take home is actually the wage that they get minus what they're spending on carers like nannies and nurses if it's the elderly and the sick. And then out of that, a further chunk is now being deducted in terms of taxation. While the study finds that there's no, the intensive margin is not as adversely affected for females, one wonders how much the extensive margin will be affected by the taxation in the case of females who are already, for reasons like discouraged worker phenomenon, fighting shy of the labor force. So therefore, I think that particularly the fact that Kanishka emphasizes the need for looking at gender dimensions with regard to the taxation and the labor market, I think it's very important, particularly given that we are going through a demographic transition where we would like to have more females entering the labor market. But as a result of this taxation, I feel that there could be further adverse impacts discouraging female workers. So Kanishka's paper, in focusing on the differences between genders, I feel is playing a very important role in guiding policymakers. And even in the suggestions he made, I noticed the one about providing care, credits for care of children and special transfer payments towards the female labor force. And those, I think, are very important in the context. Fine. Thirdly, I am really impressed by the fact that the paper, when it's using the difference in difference and DDD approach, it remains very methodologically rigorous, and all the robustness tests that he discussed show that he put in a lot of econometric work into providing what are very, acceptable and rational conclusions. But what I was impressed with was the fact that the fluidity with which he brought in the econometrics that made the paper very readable, and it supported all the theoretical and empirical trends that he wanted to bring about, but in a way that it was, the econometrics did not intrude, but played a very important supportive role, and I really appreciate that about the paper. So the paper was a very solid piece of work, and it provided, stimulating reading and indicating clearly that, there is a major negative impact coming with the higher taxes, particularly that it has major repercussions on the equity concerns. So with that, one may wonder why, like Oliver Twist, I'm asking for more. But I was interested to note that even, strangely, that even Tiloka was sort of suggesting some of this, the couple of things that I suggest were also being suggested by Tiloka. The first thing is about the fact that Kanishka makes it clear that this paper tends to be more into microanalysis than macroanalysis. But given that he talks about the issues that, where the impacts on productivity and the impacts on possible impacts on capital formation, because when we think about productivity, the fact that people are taxed, it's discouraging workers, the opposite of efficiency wages in a sense. And then here we have a situation where there are workers with experience are moving out of their jobs either to the informal sector or maybe even overseas. And this too can have major productivity impacts. When labor is becoming more expensive due to taxation, if the workers are able to shift the tax burden onto the employers, then there will be a labor demand issues coming up, and where mechanization might become quite a popular option. So in this context, I think it is very important that this paper that is actually extended or further looked at, that the issues are further revisited with a from a macroeconomic lens. Particularly, this is important because I think that while the paper suggests that taxation should become, should be done cautiously, because there is the issue that, the impacts of the formal and informal sector substitution in particular, it suggests that it is important to look at these issues in relation to how they impact the macroeconomy further, because the negative impacts affect unemployment, affect inflation, can have a major bearing on economic growth. So I would really strongly suggest that the issues are revisited from a macroeconomic perspective. Secondly, of course, the issue of the fact that relates to going in the opposite direction from suggesting that, going from microeconomics to macroeconomics, I also agree with Tiloka that it would be very interesting if there could be more work done at a household level. So I am suggesting more household analysis, where we are looking at two issues. One is when the workers are going from the formal sector to the informal sector. Empirically, it is interesting to know whether they go into the informal sector as employees, as employers, or as own account workers. And then, having said that, it is also very important to note that this more workers going into the informal sector is bringing down wages in the informal sector, and this is particularly likely to be happening in the case of less skilled workers. And this, of course, has a very interesting repercussion where we are talking about taxation, progressive taxation, which should be pro equality, but then if there is this major impact happening on the informal sector, which sort of takes in a lot of the labor that cannot, for lack of skills or education, go into the formal sector. It is sort of the soaking up sector. This being adversely affected has a very major impact on equality, because it is going to be affecting the poor workers in the informal sector further, where additional workers coming into the sector is pushing down wages. Finally, to think of the issue in terms of more, in terms of normative economics, it would be very interesting if more work could be done in the future about how people are perceiving the relationship in terms of particularly females about the workforce. We know that is a very small percentage of females who are working, and what the social norms are in this context, and how the lack of social institutions to take care of the elderly or children under regulated systems. This needs to be looked at in more detail, because from the viewpoint of taxation, there could be a lot that can be done through corporate taxation. Here, talking in terms of tax holidays or tax concessions given to organizations that provide such care, as well as taking measures to encourage more female participation by providing options like flexible working hours. So I think there's a lot of leverage that can be that the economy can benefit from if the firms are actually directed in the right directions using taxation, but not increase in taxation, but providing tax reductions to encourage the corporate sector to make the necessary movements towards increasing female labor force participation. What is the advantage? More female labor force participation would actually be desirable, finally, in terms of output, and finally in terms of possibly need for tax revenue that has led to these high tax rates being imposed on the population. So those are the points I want to make. But finally, let me thank Professor Srinivasan Iyer for having created this research initiative, where getting the researchers to look at the labor force, whether it's in terms of exports, industrialization, economic growth, or taxation, is very important, because bringing the labor force into the policy making, where it's looked at the macro and micro level rather than being put aside as labor economics. This is a very important contribution, I think, that we have made to research in the country, because particularly I want to thank the Nilanthil Selvam Trust, because these young researchers who have taken this broader perspective into policy are now going to have a very interesting research trajectory ahead of them. And I think we will all benefit from these activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amala. Thank you both for your comments as well as for your encouragement for this initiative. Thank you very much. Now, let me move and request the audience participants whether they have some questions that they would like to pose to Kanishka. Meanwhile, let me lead in with just one more comment. I just want to draw attention to Kanishka's caveat, which he had put at the beginning, that he is analyzing a particular segment of the labor market, which earns in that bracket between 70,000 and 130,000 Sri Lankan rupees per month. And he would be quite wary of extending the results, particularly to higher income brackets. I think that is truly a worthy caveat. And that's something that as he moves towards a macroeconomic framework, he might want to broaden his analysis to pick other segments. That's one issue. Another issue is I'm wondering whether in the long run, whether direct tax records in Sri Lanka actually enable a disaggregated picture of tax collection from various income segments. Okay, we have one person who's raised a hand. I am unable to. Can he or she please pose the question?
Go ahead, Sakuntala.
Yeah, Sakuntala. Sakuntala, are you there? Hello, you might have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Can the admin unmute Sakuntala, please?
Hello?
Maybe there is a technical glitch,
Yeah,
Srini. We can, yeah.
I think we will have to move on. Let me just turn to Kanishka. Oh, Harini, you have your hands up in case you want to pose your question. And then we'll need to move on to give Kanishka some time to respond. A very, very brief set of response. Harini, over to you.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. If you want, you
All
can
right.
also turn your camera on. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you so much, Kanishka. That was a super interesting presentation. I just had like a very boring, I guess, technical question on your treatment and control groups. And I joined the presentation sort of a bit late, so maybe you had already covered that. But what did you do any sort of additional tests to show us that your treatment and control groups are similar, because there are two groups in slightly different tax brackets? So whether there were any, I don't know, demographic characteristics or other things that might sort of be different across the groups? Did you look into that? Thank you.
Thank you, Harini. Let me just turn to, I think we'll need to stop the Q&A. Thank you very much, Harini. Kanishka, over to you. You have about 7 minutes for your responses. Thank you, Harini. Kanishka,
Thank you.
can you please come in?
Yes. Hi, Srini. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the comments and also the concerns. And I would like to especially thank Prof Amala De Silva and also Dr. Tiloka for being my reviewers and for their original comments. And I admit that there are certain loopholes that I should work on. Particularly, also there are certain things that I'm also interested in exploring more, as particularly Dr. Tiloka mentioned. Something that I'm really, really interested in exploring is because there is some sort of an issue in terms of applying standard labor leisure trade-off model with salaried workers and also particularly the government workers, since they have fixed monthly salary. So, but I'm very curious because of the data limitations, because mainly when it comes to LFS, what we have is the monthly income, and also we have a question called any kind income, and other than that we don't have any way to capture their other income levels. So given that, it will be a little bit questionable how to incorporate that aspect into the paper, but something that I thought I can do is disregarding these salaried government workers and focus on the other types of workers when it comes to this, and check whether these models, whether the findings will be similar or not. And that is something I'm really, really interested. And also something that you mentioned particularly was, so I was developing an argument that maybe secondary workers joining the labor force because of the after the tax. So that is actually something that we can empirically test using the available data. but we may have to incorporate some sort of a household modeling structure to that, because in that sense, I think maybe people may make the decision at the household level. So I should think about how to incorporate this household dimension into the model. And I admit that there are a lot of things that I should work on. And thank you very much, ma'am, for your kind help and support, and also the comments throughout the process. And also in terms of Amala madam, I think thank you very much, Professor Amala, for your comments. And also I'm also interested in understanding in which type of activities that they will be engaged once the formal sector workers are moved to informal sector. But unfortunately, what happened was I did a cluster or pseudo panel analysis or clustered panel analysis. In that sense, we are analyzing some group of people. We are taking some group of people as the unit observation. So there is no way that I can capture their individual characteristics. But I think it would be really, really interesting if we can incorporate that aspect also. And also, Madam, thank you very much for mentioning the Laffer curve and that theoretical background. That I really enjoyed that. And thank you very much for all the comments. And hopefully, this is a working paper, so I think I should be working towards improving that paper in the future. So I will make sure to incorporate all your comments to the best I can when I improve the paper. And thank you very much, Dr. Tiloka, and also Professor Amala, again for your kind I mean, first of all, thank you for accepting my request to be my reviewers, given your busy schedules and everything. And also thank you very much for being here today at the session, and thank you very much for the support. And in terms of Harini's comment, thank you, Harini, for the interest. Actually, I can share the paper with you. What I did was, in terms of, because of the data limitations, I couldn't properly develop visually indicated the parallel trend assumption, but I carried out some placebo tests, assuming that there is a tax reform in 2018 January, and that supported my results pretty much. And also here with the intensive labor supply analysis, I used initially the 30% band, and I developed and I retested the hypothesis with 40% and 20% band. And also I corrected sample selection bias mainly. So those are the robustness checks I mainly conducted. I don't know whether you asked, whether I answered your exact question, but I can share my paper with you, and I would love to have your comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kanishka. I was going to say, if the paper is shareable, I'd love to read it. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kanishka. I think we need to move on. So thank you very much, and thanks to both the discussants as well as the audience. Thank you, Kanishka. Wish you the best for the future.
Yeah, thank you so much.